You know that part of yourself you try not to look at? The one that feels messy, complicated, embarrassing, or just really hard to face? That's your shadow. My new book, Dark Shadow, Golden Shadow, published by Wiser, is all about learning to see that part of yourself and realizing it's not something to eliminate or fear, but something to understand, because it often impacts all aspects of our life and our relationships without us even realizing it. My book blends psychology, tarot, and therapeutic self-reflection to help you move from shame to awareness and integration. Dark Shadow, Golden Shadow comes out December 8th, but it's available for pre-order now wherever books are sold. You are listening to The Tarot Diagnosis. I'm your host, Shannon. I'm a licensed psychotherapist, and I also happen to have a love for tarot. Each episode, I invite you to reflect with me as I work to demystify the tarot and the human experience, all while exploring tarot's connection to mental and emotional health. While this podcast may feel therapeutic, it is not meant to take the place of psychotherapy. So grab your cards and join me as I work to create a pathway to better understand ourselves and those around us. I'm exploring a topic today that I don't think I've explored on the podcast before. And I actually didn't have any intention of talking about this. And then recently I had pulled the Six of Wands for a spread that I had created for my recent Meeting the Shadow workshop inside the symposium. And I had such an interesting kind of moment with this card where I started looking at it through a different lens. And obviously, I think it was influenced by the state of the world, everything that's going on. I live in the United States, so everything that's happening in the United States. And I was thinking about how this card relates to power. It's typically a card that we look at and we think, oh, it's a triumphant card. This person has clearly succeeded and they're being cheered on and they're being recognized, and all their hard work has paid off. And I think a lot of us have a relatively positive relationship to this archetype. And we all want to feel that Six of Wands energy. We all want to be on that horse being celebrated. But, as I sat with this card a little bit longer, and in addition to being influenced by the state of the world, I, was also in the midst of working through this workshop on shadow work. So I absolutely was seeing and experiencing this card through a shadow lens. So when I was looking at it through this lens of the shadow and shadow work, I'm like, okay, well, this is a very kind of heavy card then, rooted in things like envy and spitefulness and arrogance. And I was thinking, so when I had pulled a card, it was specifically in the position of the shadow. And I was thinking about how a shadow for this card would be when other people are almost kind of quietly celebrating when others fail. And if you know anything about the shadow, the shadow is a part of us that we want to repress, we want to deny, we want to ignore, we want to create as much space and distance between us and this part, this feeling, this internal experience as possible, because, it's rooted in shame. We're not proud of it. We're embarrassed by it. And that is absolutely a thought that people aren't going to, gladly shout like, oh, this person failed, I'm so happy. But I was thinking about how this card absolutely represents that shadow experience. How, there might be this kind of bitter part of us that feels good when other people are down, or we feel angry when someone else is on that horse, when someone else is experiencing that Six of Wands, basically. And yeah, like we don't want to admit that. And so I was sitting with how that represents a shadow. And then I just felt kind of thrust into how that relates to what we are experiencing collectively in the world. And, I started to wonder, I'm looking at this card and looking at all the people surrounding it and having this really kind of visceral reaction. And I started to wonder, do these people know who or what they're cheering for? And do they know what their celebration is causing? Even like from a psychological standpoint, a neurological standpoint, like a deep chemical response because power is it can be really dangerous. And I was thinking about how and this is where the inspiration for the episode kind of came. I was thinking about that quote, how people say like, oh, money is the root of all evil. And I was like, oh, but is it? What if it's power? And I sure some people might argue, well, you can't have power without money, but I don't think that's true. The two absolutely can be intertwined. But, I think back to my early years as a therapist working with, and even before I was a therapist, in 2010 is when I really started my career as a domestic violence counselor. And, I'm thinking about those situations where many of those relationships existed in conditions of poverty, but the absence of money did not reduce the danger of power. And power very much still existed. I mean, when you think about domestic violence, it is power. It is all about power and control. And yeah, money can be a part of it. But so I was like, oh my gosh, like, in fact, sometimes the less money there was, the more power seemed to have been exerted, through control, through fear, through isolation. So in that case, violence wasn't necessarily fueled by wealth. It was more fueled by needing to dominate, needing to feel powerful. And then later on, after that, I transitioned to working in the field of addictions. And then I was like, okay, this is also another form of power. Like, my clients would come in shaking, hungry, didn't have a penny to their name. The majority of them were unhoused folks. And in this specific realm of addiction that I was working in was in methamphetamine and heroin. And so, we're not talking about like cannabis use. Like this is like big, heavy stuff. And the power that had over them was, so distressing. And there was, again, no wealth or money involved in that. And some people, again, I can hear people kind of like arguing with me saying, oh, you have to have money in order to buy that. Not all the time. There are plenty of things that you can exchange for drugs. It is not always money. So I stand by this, maybe money isn't the root of all evil. Maybe it really is power. And, now I look at the kind of like larger world here and, it's hard not to see, how the same, the shadow of power plays out everywhere in politics and corporations, in relationships, within ourselves. I mean, even in, social media, the spiritual world, I'm at this like kind of like interesting intersection of kind of all of these worlds. I always feel like I'm at a four-way stop and I'm like dead center of that four-way stop where I don't quite belong in any of these corners. That's a whole other discussion. But just like thinking about how this concept doesn't discriminate and it exists everywhere. I mean, clearly, you're listening to me ramble right now. So I went down just an entire kind of rabbit hole of what this means. And so when I'm looking at the Six of Wands, I realize that the angle that we're seeing is also fascinating because it almost feels like we're enveloped by the energy. Like we're not entirely zoomed in, but we're also not zoomed out enough that we have some peripheral. And I think that was what was most fascinating to me because art is so immersive, and this card felt immersive where, if you look at something like, like the 10 of Cups, where we kind of have this zoomed out view and we can see the horizon and we can see children playing off in the distance. And, there's maybe a couple in the foreground or other cards where we can kind of like see what's happening in the distance. And we have all of that input that helps influence our experience with the card. And with the Six of Wands, the framing is fascinating because we are in it. Like we clearly, this person on the horse is the central focus. but I feel like I'm sucked into the crowd and there's no kind of seeing what's going on around us. And I think that's an important component here to consider when we think about the impact that power has, not just on the person who we're giving power to, but also the people who are celebrating and cheering on and helping that person feel and experience power. Another aspect to this is power's intoxicating. It's addictive. Which I'm going to get all into the neuroscience of it in a minute, but it corrupts us. It corrupts the world. It consumes us. And I think that's what makes it so dangerous, because people get high off of power. They get high off of a sense of superiority. They get high off of feeling in control. And the more they get a taste of that, the more they need it. If you've ever been in a position of power, and I think like a relatable example of this is if you've ever been in a work position where, let's say, like you're kind of like working your way up and maybe you get laid off or something happens and you lose your job. And ideally, when you're hunting for another job, you would either make a lateral move where, you are in a very similar position, similar pay, or you take a couple steps up the ladder and you're in a higher paying position, more responsibilities. So you feel like there's a sense of growth. Think about what happens in those moments when we don't have a choice but to take a few steps down and take a lower paying job or a job with lesser responsibility. That really messes us up. I can't tell you, and I've been in that position before, and I remember like significantly struggling with what that meant about my worth and my value. And I've had so many clients over the years experience something similar. Because when we have a taste of and I'm not talking about this in like a shadowy, detrimental sense, but, when we have a taste of where we've been and, maybe having some power in some sense, whether that's like, in a leadership role or manager or whatever, to then go from like being a leader or a manager to not, it just feels debilitating. It feels weird. It feels like somehow we are epic failures. And so think about folks who have significant power. They want to keep it because, it's like, I'll never forget early in my career, I had an experience where someone told me they did this like epic thing, and they did this epic thing very young. And our work together was so much related to, well, now what am I supposed to do for the rest of my life? I think they were in their early 20s. We'll say they were 22. I did this thing at 22. That is like something that most people, strive their entire life to do. And it's like, that one bucket list item or whatever. And they were like, but I've done it. So what else is there now? And when you get into that space of power, when you were on that horse, when you were in that 6 of Wands, if that goes unchecked, like power can do to us, make us completely unaware of what's happening around us, we fall into that mindset of there is nothing else. And so I have to do everything I can to stay here. And I will do anything to stay here. And that means anything at the expense of other people. And, this is like where it falls into similar to addictive tendencies. It's, we start to justify, well, I've earned this. I deserve it. We might even think, oh, well, I'm helping people. But soon that kind of like line between empowerment and exploitation starts to blur. And we see this play out every day in our society. I've seen it happen. I've seen it happen in the therapy room. I've seen it happen with, unfortunately, colleagues and clients. We've all seen it happen in the workplace, in social media and in spiritual places. There's this like hunger and desire to stay on the horse, to feed the ego with adoration and admiration, to stay relevant, to stay loved, to stay needed, to stay wanted. And power really feeds on all of that validation. And when it's not tempered by reality or just some empathy, it really turns people cold and cruel. So while I was kind of reflecting on the concept of power in the Six of Wands, I was like, oh, I need to pull out Lane Smith's 78 Acts of Liberation. It's been a little while since I've read it. And I was like, I need to see what they said about the Six of Wands. And so I grabbed the book and I'm, flipping to the Six of Wands and I'm like, oh, yeah, there it is. This idea of like a collective movement. And Smith kind of reframes this archetype with the phrase move up, which I love. It's an adaptation of the activist principle, step up, step back. And like the idea is if you are taking up more space, if you are someone who maybe has the privilege to take up more space or you've given more space, it's important to remember to step back and listen. And then if you are someone who is always staying back and listening, you tend to be more quiet. It's your job to work towards moving up and using your voice. And what I kind of love about this interpretation and how Lane explores this is it's challenging the typical power dynamic that we see in the world, that we see in the Six of Wands. And it really reminds us that the person on the horse, isn't existing in isolation. They are only there because we have put them there. And it's the people walking beside them. It's people holding up the banners, the cheering. It's all of those people are making that moment possible. Without that crowd, without the cheering, there is nothing to celebrate. There is no moment of feeding the power beast. And, I also want to say, I know that there's nuance here. I'm not saying that we should never cheer people on because that's not right either. We absolutely should be celebrating people. I mean, I would argue we need to be celebrating the right people, but it's also our responsibility when we are on the horse. And this goes to what Lane was talking about in 78 Acts of Liberation. It is our responsibility to understand when we have taken up a lot of space. How long have we been on the horse? How long have we been letting these people cheer for us? And are we just sitting there just reveling in it? Or are we saying, oh, hey, you know what? I have this space. While I have everyone's attention, let me bring some people up on this horse with me who have some other things to say or some other things to share, or they have victories worth acknowledging that maybe have not been able to be acknowledged because they don't have the platform that I have or the privilege that I have. So, thinking about it that way, the Six of Wands starts to feel a little less like maybe like a personal win and maybe a little bit more like an invitation to consider what do we do once we've been given power? Because, this concept of moving up that Lane talks about, it doesn't have to be about domination. It's really just about showing up with awareness. And then the moving back doesn't have to be about making yourself smaller or diminishing your accomplishments. It's just about making sure that there's enough room for everybody to coexist. And I think that's honestly why the shadow side of this card fascinates me so much, because when power goes unchecked, it isolates us. Not only does it isolate the person in power, but it also isolates the people who have kind of celebrated that and allowed that person to be in power. It separates the rider, the person on the horse from the crowd. Look at that. They're completely elevated. The voices are isolated. It's easy to hear the voice of the person on the horse because we're all waiting to hear it. It's so much more difficult to hear a voice from the crowd because no one's paying attention to those voices. But when power is shared, it becomes something collaborative and it becomes something beneficial and it becomes more about empowerment and care. I also wanted to go back to Mary K. Greer's book, The Complete Book of Tarot Reversals, just to kind of see what she had to say about the Six of Wands. And also, not surprised, she really just kind of cuts right to it and talks about how she specifically explores how the Six of Wands follows the chaos of the five. and it being this kind of like symbol, or symbolizing a moment when someone finally rises above conflict. And it's like being seen and chosen and recognized, and that's great. But she still warns us that this is where like the quote unquote real test begins. So because like I've been saying, the Six of Wands can easily shift from, hey, we're celebrating you, like great job, like you deserve this, to now the ego has become inflated. And when our sense of identity starts to depend on that adoration, that admiration, the applause, we risk losing the balance that got us there. And then everything starts to become hollow and we lose sight of reality. There was a fantastic article published in the National Library of Medicine in 2023 called On Power and Its Corrupting Effects, the Effects of Power on Human Behavior and the Limits of Accountability Systems, which I will link in the show notes. But I wanted to take a moment to highlight some of the most eye-opening findings about our response and our relationship to power. And I'm going to tie them all into different tarot archetypes. So I pulled a few of what I thought were the most kind of prominent and fascinating facts about our relationship to power. Some I've already explored and talked about, and some I haven't. But the first one that I have talked about is kind of the neurobiological experience of power, and that's power is neurologically addictive. And so I think, from a traditional tarot standpoint, we tend to think of that as relating to the devil. It's this compulsion, it's an obsession, loss of control. The devil's the archetype of addiction. That's the card we consider when we're thinking about this. And it's not even just addiction to substances, like it's to people, or like in this case, power. And it really shows how domination can become its own drug. And it stimulates those same pleasure circuits as desire and control does. Another one, and I touched on this a little bit, was that power erodes our ability to be empathetic and compassionate. And so this, of course, feels like the reverse Queen of Cups, where we become emotionally cold, maybe even manipulative. We have empathy fatigue, and the reverse Queen of Cups embodies all of that. It's lack of emotional intelligence, it's detachment. It's when our feelings, or more importantly, the feelings of others, are used from a strategic perspective. So this is where like the manipulation comes in, rather than from a sincere, genuine caring. Another one is that power creates a sense of self-righteousness and also an experience of moral hypocrisy, which very much feels like the reversed Hierophant. The dogma, moral rigidity. And, I think when we look at the Hierophant, especially reversed, it's really kind of like what's often underneath all of that. And, bigotry, hypocrisy, folks who preach certain virtues and then, behind closed doors, are breaking those. It's when you feel morally exceptional. And we see that so much. Oh my gosh, especially now. And this is a clear indication that a certain belief system or a certain preaching, or, standing on a podium and spewing whatever without any sort of self-awareness or introspection is really just control disguised as like a sense of righteousness. And then power fuels entitlement and unethical behavior. So I feel like if I were to attach a card to this one, it would probably be Nine of Cups. I think of that person, sitting with their arms crossed. We tend to think of him as a smug. And this can very much feel like a sense of entitlement. Like, yeah, I deserve all of these cups and I don't care what I have to do to get them. It's greed. It's, welcoming and seeking excess when other people have nothing, even though you have the ability to live and exist in a world comfortably and help others live comfortably without jeopardizing your own well-being. But it's like hoarding all the resources. And thinking about resources, I might even throw a Pentacles card in there. Maybe Nine of Pentacles, I think. Both nines here would be fitting. Nine of Pentacles and Nine of Cups for sure. Another one is power encourages aggression and dehumanization. And this was interesting to read about as well. And again, highly encourage if this topic fascinates you to check out this article, this study. And I feel like that probably maybe Five of Swords energy, that I'm going to take what's mine. I'm going to exploit. I'm going to humiliate. I'm going to feel victorious despite what happens to anybody else. Kind of lack of awareness, domination. Another thing that showed up in this article was how power sexualizes social interactions. That was fascinating. And I think I would probably link that to either the Two of Cups reversed, or if you want to get just really traditional, the Lovers. So that's a violation of boundaries, feeling entitled to other people, an imbalance in relationships, and also like the seduction of control, the seduction of power, misuse of intimacy. I see this so much in corporate America too, where, people come in and have been exploited and sexualized by, people in leadership or roles of power, and have used that to their advantage. Another concept that they explored is that power impairs our ability to be cooperative, and it impairs our ability to consider different perspectives. So absolutely feels like Two of Wands energy here. So power gives you tunnel vision. You become arrogant. You don't want to collaborate. It's like your way or no way. You are standing on this balcony surveying everything that, is kind of at your disposal, and having zero curiosity about what it might look like to have other people on that balcony with you. Another component was they said that power distorts perception and amplifies bias, which, I think we can all agree with that. And that feels very much like justice, reversed. The bias, the corruption, unfair judgment, maybe bending the truth in order to serve someone in power, which, oh my gosh, we're seeing this so much right now. And, justice reversed can also feel like just being selective with what you're choosing to perceive too. So fairness becomes kind of filtered through power and through, that kind of intoxicating opportunity to be in control. Another component here, which we have not spent much time, actually, I don't think I've talked about this at all, but I talk about this, and thinking about it from a clinical perspective often, but power dynamics exist even kind of outside this whole kind of the world that I'm currently exploring. And it can often exist in like victimhood. So, this might be the shadow of the Five of Pentacles, for example, where someone is having a hard time stepping outside of like a victim mentality. And there's this kind of like moral superiority that is experienced through suffering. And this is where like manipulation can take hold too. And we have to be careful with this because we also don't want to victim blame. And that's not what this is about whatsoever. This is like a genuine situation when people are using a possibility of being a victim like to their advantage. And it's fascinating because they can wield this like suffering as kind of like a badge of honor or like moral leverage to hold power through sympathy. So it's like people taking advantage of other people's empathy and sympathy. And the last one that I wanted to point out might feel the most resonant right now, and that's kind of power's structural protection, which this concept really feels like the Tower. Because when we think about how like our justice system or government or corporations, these systems have hierarchical ceilings, and there's not many people who can hold the top people accountable. So the higher your authority, the more power you have, the less likely you are to be held accountable, the less likely you are to ensure that you're not abusing your power, the less likely there are to be checks and balances. We see this in courts and corporations and governments, like all of these systems are constrained, and it very much feels like the tower. Like at some point it will collapse. And, there's this kind of inevitable downfall of systems that are built on, I think, the denial of that hierarchy or the unwillingness to get creative in how to better support it. So, it's fascinating to think about how I have been on this like 6 of Wands journey and then fell down the rabbit hole of researching power. And, I think a lot of folks have been thinking about this lately too. It's obviously coming up a lot in my conversations personally and professionally. And I think we all have a role to play here. And our role and our job is to stay grounded when we are given power and when we are in positions of control, because we need to remember that power physically and psychologically changes us. And in order to stay grounded and rooted in reality, that might look like making sure we have a wide circle of influence, making sure that we are trying to invite different voices, or, practicing what Lane talked about in the 78 Acts of Liberation, like move up, stepping forward when we tend to hold back, or stepping back when we tend to take up too much space. Because I think that's really just what the world needs and what we all need right now. Thank you so much for listening to The Tarot Diagnosis. For more tarot and mental health content, follow The Tarot Diagnosis on Instagram. You can also subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, and sign up to receive the Tarot Diagnosis emails, where you'll have access to exclusive spreads and exciting announcements. To join an incredible community of tarot and psychology enthusiasts, join the Tarot Diagnosis membership community, The Symposium, by visiting thetarotdiagnosis.com.